does the Bible really say it is better not to marry? And why have many Christian leaders for centuries held to a tradition of celibacy? Well, we're going to explore those issues here, and I'm going to provide some of my own perspective after just recently getting married. To understand what the Bible says about marriage, we need to start at the beginning. In Genesis chapter 1, God created the first man and the first woman and instituted the covenant of marriage, along with the command that they should be fruitful and multiply. So here we see that marriage was good and was created for a purpose. But if we fast forward through the Old Testament, we can see that not every marriage turned out the way it should have. Perhaps this is why Proverbs says, "It is better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife." But Proverbs also has some rather positive things to say about marriage. It says, "He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord." There's also a whole book of poetry in the Old Testament about the beauty of love and marriage. So on the whole, it seems like the Old Testament scriptures have a rather positive view of marriage. But that's why it may be somewhat surprising when we get to the New Testament and see a somewhat different story. We can start with the example of Jesus, who never married and actually taught his disciples that for the one who is able to receive it, that it is better not to marry. This may sound surprising, but it actually aligns with the rest of the New Testament teaching, but requires a bit more context to understand. The most detailed teaching in the Bible on the consideration of marriage comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Here, the Apostle Paul writes something rather strong, saying, "It is better for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." This could sound extreme or perhaps confusing of what Paul meant if he didn't spend the rest of the chapter explaining what he meant. The very next verse says, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband." So these verses together seem to indicate maybe some good standard of abstinence and celibacy, but then Paul clarifies that because of the temptation to sexual immorality, it is better for such relations to be established and kept within the bounds of marriage. I would like to point out though how this compares to our culture. Many people in our culture want to live a lifestyle that enjoys some of the benefits of marriage, but avoids most of the responsibility and commitment. They usually say they aren't ready to get married, or that they don't want to be constrained or held by outdated ideas. But as we've already seen, marriage was instituted by God, and that marriage is the only morally acceptable condition for sexual relations. So from all we've seen so far, marriage is good, wholesome, and purposeful. But that doesn't explain why Jesus and Paul both taught and exemplified the merits of celibacy. So to answer definitively what the Bible says about this, we need to keep reading what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Here, Paul seems to have two guiding principles. The first, effectiveness in sharing the gospel. And the second, stable and pure individuals and families. For the first of these principles, Paul argues that individuals could be more effective in serving the Lord if they are single. He says, "I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband." So this seems rather conclusive then in Paul's judgment. However, he does clarify elsewhere in the chapter saying, "I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another." So this seems to leave the door open then for other interpretations or applications from this chapter, but on the whole, it still provides a rather strong endorsement of the practice of celibacy. The other guiding principle, though, that Paul outlines in this chapter is stable and pure individuals and families. To this, Paul lays out two additional guiding principles. The first, he says, "Do not seek a wife or spouse." But the second says, "It is better to marry than to burn with passion." And to build on his second point, Paul says, as we've already noted, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. But he quickly clarifies this by saying, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this." So from this, we can see that Paul recognizes the value and purpose of biblical marriage, but in some ways still tries to push back on the overly sexualized society and at least establish important guardrails or even promote the merits of complete celibacy. Paul concludes his thoughts on this topic by saying, "So then he who marries does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better." This might all seem surprising, especially given the normalcy and support for marriage among Christians. However, when we take a step back and view this teaching in the rest of the biblical context, we can see that these teachings from Jesus and Paul, they don't mandate any one approach toward marriage, and certainly don't mean that every Christian should be celibate, but rather mostly teach that marriage, while important, shouldn't be our highest focus and purpose. And for those who are called to a life of celibacy, it certainly isn't a lesser calling, but in some ways may actually be a higher calling. This teaching, along with the examples of Jesus, Paul, and other early church fathers who followed in their footsteps, have set a tradition of celibacy among church leaders, especially in the Catholic and Orthodox churches. There was some diversity of examples in the early church. For example, the Apostle Peter, who is recognized by the Catholic Church as the first pope, was married. But as the early church grew and spread, many adopted or idealized a monastic way of life, which held to a tradition of celibacy. And later Christian fathers also adopted and promoted this lifestyle, including ones like Ambrose and Augustine. However, early Christian councils, such as the Council of Nicaea of the famed Nicene Creed, did not impose any standard of marriage or celibacy on the entire church. But by AD 692, the Quinisext Council, meaning 5th, 6th Council, established that, at least for the Eastern churches, that bishops must be celibate. But ordained priests, deacons, and other church leaders could marry. And this is the position that is held by most Orthodox churches today. There continued to be a diversity of thought and practice in the Western Church until the 11th century, when Pope Gregory VII decreed that all Catholic bishops and priests should be celibate, which has been the standard ever since in the Catholic Church. With the Reformation, though, in the 16th century, most Christian leaders outside the Catholic Church have not held to a tradition of celibacy. However, it does seem like there may be something that perhaps we can all learn from this history of celibacy and its theological foundations. Well, I promised I would share some of my own thoughts after just recently getting married. My first thought would be that marriage is amazing, and I love my wife very much. But it also isn't without its challenges and responsibilities. There are times when I think I could do more towards some ministry task if I wasn't married. But then I also come back to the realization of the amazing blessing that my wife shares in the ministry calling and purpose we have together. So my personal recommendation is twofold. If you're not married, listen to what the Apostle Paul says and do not seek a spouse. Meaning, don't follow the rest of our culture in making relationships the central focus of your life and existence. But if God does provide someone for you, be incredibly thankful and committed to that one exclusively for the rest of your life. And if God never provides a spouse, don't feel as if you have any lesser of a calling. In fact, if you are willing to receive it, and the key is actually receiving it, you may have an even greater calling of undivided ministry and service for God. Thanks for watching with me as we navigated this interesting and challenging topic. There's a lot more that could be said, and we might have to save more of that for upcoming videos. So if you'd like to hear more about this and other interesting topics, make sure you're subscribed. And please like and share this video with others to help encourage them of what the Bible has to say on topics like this. And if you'd like to support the mission of Anchor Bible College further, check out our website at anchorbiblecollege.org or consider donating through the link in the description. Thanks for watching.